Hey there, spiritualpreneurs. Welcome to our podcast where we talk about all the things mental health and spirituality.
That's right. We're your host, Biani and Sequoia, and we're here to provide you with the tools, tips, and insights to help you navigate your spiritual journey and maintain your mental wellness.
As millennials, we understand the unique challenges that come with balancing our spiritual practices with our everyday lives. From managing our careers to building relationships, it can be tough to find the time and energy to prioritize our mental and spiritual health.
But that's where we come in. Each episode, we'll be sharing our personal experiences, interviewing experts in the field, and exploring different spiritual practices to support you and ourselves on this journey of unlearning from mental health programs, incorporating spirituality, and embodying our identities as spiritualpreneurs.
So, whether you're a seasoned spiritualpreneur or just starting out on your journey, this podcast is for you. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to elevate your mental health and spiritual well being.
Let's get started.
Today, we are going to talk about what we wish we knew about social work programs. Social work programs don't prepare you for the realities of the work we do in the field. And as much as they promise this type of preparation, the truth is that it is a lie, honey. Hmm. Social work programs often prepare us to be complicit with the power structures we claim to fight against, to neglect our boundaries, and to be in a persistent state of burnout.
Whoo. Welcome, y'all. Reclaiming Soul Work is a heart centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, mental health, and everything in between. Um, I'll share. My name is Biani. My pronouns are she, they. I am a Black, Latinx, queer, non binary femme. I live and play in Lenape-Hoking. I'm a therapist in private practice, a tarot reader, mama, homeschooling mama of three, doula, and all things healing. um, and I want to just acknowledge the land that I live on, Lenape-Hoking. Um, and it's also a place known as Philadelphia. And yeah, we're sort of happy to be here and excited to have this conversation. That's why I kind of was like, ooh, because it is a deep conversation, y'all. We're going deep. Um, my friend, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Sequoia. I use she and her pronouns. I identify as a Black queer therapist, artist, business owner. I live in Anchorage, Alaska on Denaina land and caregive. Go back and forth to Chicago and wear a few different hats, but really, really excited to be here to talk to y'all today about this topic. We are definitely in an interesting season just related to, the school year, if you will. And so, yeah, I just wanted to have this conversation um, about what we wish we knew about social work programs. Um, and we definitely started off, you know, coming in hot. So I'm excited to talk more about this.
I feel like if people know us, I think that's just our style. I think we're just,
That's
it's our
right.
it's
That's what
because
it
Aries is,
is.
yeah, it's really like our Aries moon. Like we're gonna come in hot and we're gonna go deep. So this is the podcast for you if you're ready to go deep and do that unlearning so that we can get free as healers and folks in our community. Um, but before we get into it, we wanted to kind of make some space to share to share something we've been thinking about and folks in our community often think about. So we wanted to have like this segment about like engaging a question from our community. And a question that we often get from folks is, what is the difference between a faith-based therapist and a spiritual therapist? If anything, that's such a common question that I know I often get and I know Sequoia gets. So we wanted to address it before we got right into the episode. Again, What is the difference between a faith-based therapist and a spiritual therapist? Did you want to also, I just want to acknowledge how Sequoia got all the sun today, baby. I'm loving this. I'm loving this for you. You deserve it, my friend. You deserve all the light. Okay, let's get back to the question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that so much. And I think it's an interesting segue, into this question about faith-based and, spirituality. And, I think it's really important to make the distinction, because I want folks to know that this is, at least for our platform, it is an open place and space for folks to express, themselves. And also, we are more leaning towards the spiritual side as opposed to the faith-based side. So
Mhm.
meaning not necessarily centering religion.
Right. Right. Like we both are consider ourselves spiritual therapists.
Hmm.
This space is for spiritual therapists. And when we think about faith-based therapy, counseling, um, faith-based therapy and counseling is for those who really want to integrate religion into their clinical work, whether it's a Christian counselor, a Buddhist counselor, or another counselor who wants to integrate, who wants to do clinical work through the lens of religion, and that can look like a lot of things. Um, and for sure, I think where we kind of meet. So a spiritual therapist is somebody who um, they guide folks on their path towards emotional healing, and they do it through the lens of spirituality and really also paying attention to spiritual growth and collective growth. And spiritual therapists tend to look at it more expansively, like it's not about religion. It's really about a person's relationship to spirit, to spirituality, and that can be nature, right? That can be um, source, that can be intuition. It's that can be community, right? Like community as a creativity as a spiritual practice. It can look a lot of different ways, um, and it's expansive too because it's not necessarily focused on a particular lens. Um, it's really focused on a person's spiritual growth, whatever form that means for them too. So it is also about committing to looking at them and meeting them where they are around their spiritual journey. Um, yeah, would you add anything, Sequoia?
I love that. I think about one of our earlier episodes where we kind of defined, I was sharing about my experience at a training, and they defined psychospirituality, and there was this piece where it was this connection to, again, the absolutely everything that you mentioned related to spiritual growth and development and things like that, with also this connection to psychoeducation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think that for me that is definitely a distinction. I think that distinction is important, not only, you know, related to just interventions and conversations, but then also for identity, for me being Black and queer, that distinction also identifies like where I think it acknowledges trauma, that our communities face a lot of the times within religious kind of context. So I
Yeah,
think that there's that element there too.
absolutely. We also kind of have this criteria for spiritual therapists. If you want to check out our IG and our previous episode that Sequoia mentioned, and yeah, I mean, there's a lens that's trauma informed. We acknowledge the role that religious trauma plays when we're thinking about spiritual wellness. Um, Also, looking at it through an intersectional lens, one that's a lens of like queer affirming too, because we know for a lot of our queer siblings and community, um, there's a lot of religious trauma. And at the same time, there's also this way that I would say, as like a queer person, that being in community with other queer folks feels really spiritual, like it feels. And I love that we get that space, in community. And I love that my clients feel really held by that too, that they can have a space to talk about spirituality and also talk about the trauma of religion for them, and that all of that is important, and that all of that is connected to spiritual wellness and growth. And um yeah, and then the piece around decolonizing, that's really important to us too. Like, this is all about um the reclamation piece of looking at people's cultures, like where people come from and their own spiritual practices, and making space for that in therapy and counseling feels really important as a spiritual therapist.
Mm-hmm.
But if
Mm-hmm.
y'all check out our early episodes, I believe the second one, we actually go deep into,
I
like,
think
or was it
episode
the
two
first
is
one?
right. I think it's
Right?
episode two.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
two.
you're right. Mm-hmm.
We go deep into, like, why we are inviting folks to reclaim spirituality and talk about
Mm-hmm.
spiritual therapy. So check it
Mm-hmm.
out if you haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And do let us know
I
in the comments too, like, what you think about the difference between faith-based and spiritual therapy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly, the other distinction too for me about faith-based and spiritual therapists too is from what from my personal experience, but then also just being in different Facebook groups and TikTok and things like that, right? Um, spiritual, I identify as a spiritual therapist because of my practice related to plant medicine and seeing that as a healing um practice, right? Healing tool within my practice. And for faith-based therapists, it feels like there isn't a lot of room for harm reduction. It feels more abstinence, kind of based, as opposed to, again, like recovery or harm reduction. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of space to hold, that those type of practices in conjunction with healing, so that I will add that piece to it too.
Yeah, and I actually was just thinking too around spiritual therapists tend to look at, like, the ancestral practices too as healing, right? That this reclamation of indigenous practices, African traditions, like, that we're making a lot of space for actual spiritual practices and religions that don't really get considered either, which I see that a lot in my work. I don't know how you've experienced it in community, but folks feeling like they can't talk about ATRs, or sometimes they feel scared with some therapists to talk about mediumship, or how they talk, like, exploring their relationship to guides. Okay, so shout out to Sequoia, because it's making me think of an episode Sequoia was on around this Let's Get Blunt podcast. Um, and the host was talking about this, feeling like she's not able to bring her full self to her therapist because of the complicated and the concerns people might have about what happens when we're, like, exploring non-traditional religions and spiritual practices. And for us as spiritualpreneurs and spiritual therapists, like, we are making space for that. We're making space for the practices that are still being stigmatized, to be honest, and are still
Yes.
being, like, judged by our fellow
Mm-hmm.
colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, shout out to Sequoia. That was a dope episode. We'll probably have to um yeah, anywho.
Thanks for mentioning that, Biani. Yeah, I think all of that lives within, the understanding of our distinction between those two. And, I'll just highlight again, as Biani said, like, let us know in the comments or wherever you may be hearing this conversation, what you think, about the difference between faith-based and spiritual therapists. I want to kind of shift us a little bit and move us right into, what we're here to talk about today, which, absolutely ties into our topic about what we wish we knew, right? So for today's episode, we're going to answer the following questions. Why this topic? what we wish we knew about social work programs, and then also why you might want to join our Patreon, why you just might want to go ahead and hop on that, right? So, Biani, what do you think? How do you kind of want to talk about this first? Should we just jump into why are we even talking about this?
Yeah, let's do it. I
Okay,
think this.
okay, that
So
sounds great.
yeah. So um, we do have a previous episode that we did. Especially, it would be really great for those who are, we're in social work graduation season. So, just keep that in mind. This is a shout out to those who are getting ready to enter the field. So you might really want to, check out this episode. Also, we're talking about, we're doing this topic because we really want to support millennial spiritualpreneurs who are really committed to like unlearning. This is another way that we explore our unlearning practices. This season of Reclaiming Soul Work is all about our unlearning journeys. And for us, we think it's important as spiritualpreneurs to really reflect, build a relationship to unlearning. And how do we do that if we don't really make space in community to like really be honest with ourselves, right? About um, the things that we wish we knew before we entered these programs, right? Because we know, and it's like, again, shout out to the grads, the new grads, the ones who are getting ready to graduate, the ones who just finished their first year in their grad programs, the ones who are starting, who finally like decided on their grad program and they're getting ready, for a season of being a student. But yeah, like we want to make space for the real conversations, the ones that you're not going to hear about in your grad programs, the ones you're not going to hear about from your supervisors, the ones you're not going to hear about from colleagues. This is a conversation, a loving, truthful conversation about all the things we wish we knew. Um, and we really hope that this supports you on your journey, wherever you are on your journey. Take this as an invitation to really hear our experiences and reflect on your experiences, on the things that you wish you knew or what you would like to know, right? Like if you're getting ready for your program, maybe this sparks interest in you thinking about questions you might have, and hopefully you will answer them. Or if you're just graduating, right? Entering the unlearning journey is healing, like giving yourself room to like reflect, to pause and really maybe even grieve, or maybe release like some of the things you wish you had known.
I appreciate that offering, Biani. I'm going to, hop right into what I wish I knew, before going to my social work program, and I think for me, one that I like, especially at this point in my kind of spiritualpreneur journey, have really been struggling. I continue to struggle to find resources, you know, and that are related to, again, just those intersections of spirituality, social work.
Mm.
Um, and one of the things that I wish that I would have understood just a little bit more before graduating is that when I go to trainings and things like that, um, a lot of times I am listening and then have to kind of interpret how to directly apply, that particular training clearly, right, with my community. And I feel like depending on what the topic is, this piece around like cultural and spiritual support just isn't there. Like that's not really a part of a lot of the trainings, like they'll go over the theoretical framework, and things like that. But then how folks will actually kind of apply that um in a spiritual way, or again, one that might be rooted more in like cultural practices. You always have to find very specific types of training Like if you do something like cognitive behavioral therapy, let's say for instance, right? Like it's going to be general, it's going to be like that kind of cookie cutter, right? Like it's not going to have that cultural piece. And so I think really understanding that um would have been helpful so that I could maybe shift my expectations about that. Maybe that's what it is. So for me, that's my first one.
Oh, that's a really good one. Um, and I'd love to hear from folks if you're watching, like let us know in the comments. I think that's a really good one. I think there's a lot of like learning we have to do and deep listening and then also dissecting that I wish like this idea of being a generalist is what's coming up when I hear you, how we're being trained to be generalists, which I think feels really nuanced. I'm holding the nuance here, but also really hard because it's just like impossible, really. Like, how do we apply CBT, right, with certain communities? Is it going to help? Is it actually supportive to certain communities? Yeah. Okay, I'll share mine because I can go. I appreciate that one. I So if you follow us on IG, you'll know I have a lot of things I wish I knew. But what I'll say here is I went into social work. I went into social work. I was looking at like MFT programs, um, like psychology, counseling, psych, and social work. And because I was like a closeted witch, a closeted bruja, I was like, oh yeah, social work is gonna be more like welcoming because they're holistic and they look at the person in the environment and they're working in community. And the way I was thinking was, oh, they're more progressive, like they'll be the more progressive discipline. And I went in with a rude awakening because there was not a lot of room to talk about spirituality. Anytime I even brought up the word sacred, spirituality, divination, I got the funniest looks, um, the kind of look like, why are they here kind of thing. And um, it's just interesting. And I want to stay there a little bit because I know for a lot of spiritual therapists or spiritualpreneurs who are at a place where they're like, oh yeah, like this feels right. This is who I am. There is a lot of space in making for ourselves to like grieve that we didn't really get that space in our programs. I was taught to kind of keep it in the closet. I felt like I had to go back in the closet around how witchy I was or how spiritual I was. And um, a program that purports itself to be very like open and welcoming, and yet the stigma of spirituality was so alive. Um, and it was like frowned upon too. Um, and I kind of see that even in like if I go to a training and I'm telling folks I'm a spiritual therapist, they're just sort of like, where'd you get your degree kind of thing? Like they already put us in a box as if like we don't have the training. And so yeah, um, I wonder if anybody could relate to that. I know Sequoia's nodding. I mean, that's what brought us together because we can relate to it. But if you're a spiritualpreneur, spiritual practitioner and therapist, like let us know in the comments like how this is landing on you. But yeah, like definitely the stigma.
I appreciate that, Biani. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, that's definitely one of my another one of my kind of points about what I wish I knew just around like right, like even just having the space to explore the intersections of spirituality, mental health and courses. Like I would never one because also a lot of those courses, at least where I went to University of Michigan, and a lot of those spirituality and social work courses are taught by white professors, and I'm like absolutely not. And so there's that piece. So that means something, that experience absolutely, like it means something. I want to highlight a comment that we have, because again I think that it still goes along with what we've been sharing. Um, and Dr. Truesdale says we are trained to think we are supposed to already know things as a student, so we don't go in as students who are there to learn. It's the way it gets us trapped in imposter syndrome, but really we have to get comfortable with being students. I think that's so interesting, especially like when we think about it from like a therapist perspective, right? Because we have to do practicum hours, then after you graduate, then you have to do clinical supervision and things like that. And a lot of times you're put into these very high demand, high responsibility, high like you're the person making very serious decisions for, maybe other people's families, policy that's going to impact people's families, so on and so forth, and it creates this space where it's hard to either reach out for support, trust support. Um, yeah. What
Hmm.
you think about that, Biani?
I have so many feelings. I mean, this is so much the the like American education, you know? It's so much this idea that we don't even know how to be students. Like it's just such a the endemic of the culture and the system here. Um, but yeah, I have so many feelings around this idea that even where we're learning and who we're learning from just kind of is giving me all this um
Yes.
and even yeah, I don't know. I remember in social work programs, I know I just lost my train of thought, but it's coming back. I remember being in social work programs and we have all these classes that we have to choose from, like group therapy, CBT, uh, psychodynamic, trauma focus, CBT. Like there's all these options for specializing. And it feels like we have to like get all these credentials. And what's coming up for me, as Dr. Truesdale mentions, the imposter syndrome, is a conversation Sequoia and I have been talking about offline around how a lot of our programs make us feel like we don't have the credentials, like we don't have the experience um, to hold space for people and sit with people, that we have to learn these things. And then we're not really encouraged to bring our lived experience, our own practices, that we come in as these empty vessels with no like knowledge. And the idea of being a student in my social work program meant that I had nothing to like, I was to learn. I was here to be a bank. Like, thinking of Paulo Freire, like thinking that this is the banking model. I'm a blank slate to be filled. And that also feels hard too, because it actually keeps this trap of imposter syndrome. Like we're in this cycle of imposter syndrome because we don't feel like we're enough. So we got to keep getting these trainings and these credentials so that we feel like we're enough. But we're not, we never feel like it never fills. It never fills that hole or that void we feel. Um, yeah.
I absolutely. I appreciate, that reflection. I think what you and Dr. You're talking and then Dr. Truesdale comment
Yeah.
comes in. So y'all are on the same wavelength related to this thought, right? So she adds also we are not allowed to be students. So let me be clear, especially of Black and queer, because we gotta be there and train folks in basic human interaction,
Listen.
you
Woo.
know.
Yes.
Um, so I think that there is a lot to be said about really understanding how identity and all of these other markers really tie into, I don't know, I guess like I mean of course we know what your experience is going to be, and also there's this very interesting, like, it's not intergenerational. What do you call when like certain things still carry over from like just other parts, other times in your life. So, like grad school, like we're talking about some of these things and really how we're still unlearning. And I was going to say too, this reminds me of our framework, right? The unlearning, relearning, learning, right? And really grounding in that we are always students, like that. Our framework literally sets us in the present tense of that, right? So yeah, I probably lost my thought, but that's
That's
fine.
okay. I'll come back. But yeah, I think it's true. It feels like this. What I wish I knew is this. Like I wish that we would have even the pedagogy of how we're being taught. Like I wish there was more. I really thought social work would be a place where we could bring our lived experience and bring that into like our learning. Um, and then yeah, if you are a person of the global majority, which but yet you are the minority in the program, which was true for me. Um, I didn't really learn much I mean, it took like, I had one professor that I would say I felt like I learned from. Um, but I felt like I had to really pay attention to like when I was being tokenized um, and when people were expecting me to speak for all like Black folks, which really just gets under my skin in a deep, deep way because we are a diasporic people with so many cultural like traditions and differences and just yeah, like Dr. Truesdale said, like let's talk about that, right? What I wish I knew, like that experience of being tokenized, like in these programs that often serve people of the global majority, and yet it's
Mhm.
like largely bombarded and dominated by white cis women. Um,
And I just want to add too, again, and I think that this goes back to this piece about how things still carry over from like different points in your life. It's not intergenerational. I don't know what the word is, but I'm basically trying to say like I'm gonna explain it through an example. So Bianna, you just mentioned um oh my goodness.
being tokenized.
Oh, being tokenized. Thank you so much, right? You mentioned being tokenized in the program, right? I can name after my program experience being very clearly tokenized in other social work settings and not understanding that experience, being angry, you know, about those experiences where other social workers are tokenizing me, right? So I think that the piece that I'm trying to highlight here is like what I wish I knew about experiences like that is that we aren't prepared to really address a lot of those things, right? Like we can name them a lot of the times and call them out in other kind of situations and settings, but how you're supposed to handle that necessarily with another social worker, like that, there's something very like rough about that, that is a hard lesson that I feel like that's still something that I have to like just ground myself in.
Yeah, I feel that with you, and like still kind of healing from, to be honest. Like when you said that, my heart just I felt it in my heart, and it's actually one of the other things I wish I knew that is connected to this. If it's okay for me to share, I'll be brief. Brief is feeling like the structure of the grad programs I was in was set up in a way that left me isolated. Um, and yes, part of it was being tokenized, but also even the structure of work, being in field placement all day and then having classes, but then not having space to really cultivate community, and just having my experience of having like my field placement experience, which often felt really isolating, um, especially my first year, and then being in classes where all I had time for was to be in class. And I wish I would have known. I wish they would have been more honest about that, because I did ask a lot of questions about the structure. Um, but I think the depths of the loneliness that I felt and the isolation And then adding to the fact that in the clinical track, a lot of the folks of color were like case managers, and they already been in the field, so they were taking classes on weekends. They were very it's just like it left us isolated, and it left us with a lot of disconnect from community, which is so interesting given that we are supposed to be working in community and like cultivating community as social workers. But I often felt really like alone.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to, highlight this last comment by Dr. Truesdale because again, I think that all of this is still very related, right? And just if we think about it from the sense of what we wish we knew is that, let me say for myself, what I wish I knew, right, related to this piece is that experience in grad school does not shape, right, like who you are. It doesn't take away from, where you're from. From my experience, I just had a lot of conversations during social work classes where, it just felt like there were lots of conversations about the Black community or Chicago, and these are markers for myself, right? um Black people, queer people, women, from Chicago, blah 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 blah, right? But I think, at least for me, how I'm like applying what Dr. Truesdale is talking about here, but then also you, Biani, is, just that even though we have these experiences in these programs, that we are still valued, that our experiences are very, very much still affirmed, and that these programs aren't providing us the context for who we are. And that again, that still ties into as well, like my last point about values. These programs do not teach you how to really embody values, or even like the social work ethics. And you can apply this to even if you're not from a social work program and you're from just any kind of mental health program or any kind of profession that has like some kind of like code of ethics, right? um it does not teach you how to embody those things. They kind of just teach you like what your target population or demographic or community is that want to learn more about and research that. But that does not equal value alignment. It just means that you are more researched or more aware of whatever this, again, community issue, population, whatever it is. But that is not values. And so that's the last point that I want to make. These programs, we need to work a little bit more on our values, or just be more clear about that distinction, because those are very two different things.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think the themes are, you're right. The themes are on identity, our values. Um, yeah, and also just like our experiences in our programs are part of our journey, but it's right. It doesn't represent the fullness of our experience, and that's why we're having this conversation, friends, because this is, I think that we just had this moment, right? Like thinking about the experience of being tokenized, like that there's still parts there that I'm unlearning, just like there are parts of you that you're probably unlearning. And if they are, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Um, part of this invitation is, like Sequoia said, our framework: unlearning, relearning, and learning. That we are in constant relationship to that, and that's where like our spiritual growth comes in, like collective growth, right? Because for us to be able to, yeah, like for us to really get free in a lot of ways, is really what we're talking about. We have to make space for like unlearning the things that we've just like accepted without even really noticing. And the more we name it, the less power it has over us, and the more we can really challenge it. I think one of the things that I found in my grad program, and I notice it in a lot of other social work programs, and maybe you all who are tuning in, maybe you notice it in your program, your experience of your program, that there's like a lot of preaching, but not a lot of practicing. Like preaching self-care, preaching like let's prevent burnout, preaching that we have to like really help dismantle these systems and like interrupt like the isms that are going on, and yet there's like not a lot of practice. Like I remember one of my professors was all about, oh yeah, self-care, self-care, and it's like no shade to her, but she was like really burned out, and it felt very interesting to get this advice, and yet it wasn't really being put into practice. And I felt that in some of my like field placement experiences where they were like telling me I needed to like take care of myself, and yet if I called out, it was a problem, right? Or, you know, and so we want you to pay attention to that too, like that there is some kind of, you know, discrepancy or contradiction. And when we are able to notice that contradiction or notice that like, you know, like hypocrisy, or like when we notice that there's a problem going on, we interrupt that by unlearning. We interrupt that by being like, wait, hold on, like you might be preaching this self-care thing, but you're not really doing it, you know. And it makes space for us to be like, oh, okay, then this is really important for me. I really want to make space for my self-care because this is how I'm able to show up for myself and my community, even if this person's not really practicing it, right? Or I might have to call out today to really take care of myself, and then I'll show up more rejuvenated the next time I'm at my field placement. So yeah.
I think again, these are just really impactful, like grounding places to come back to for again folks that are getting ready to graduate, folks that are just currently in the field. If you are just again in this decolonizing um practice, right? Like reflecting on your time during grad school is a really good decolonizing self-care practice. You know, we've just had conversations again with so many people where they've had actually very traumatic grad school experiences, and things that just didn't make any sense, things that were racist, things that just align more with white supremacy, and really unpacking that is important.
I'm not, yes, absolutely. We we really want to encourage you to unpack it and invite you to make space for it. Um, and I know part of that invitation is that we're inviting you to kind of drop into yourself too, because I know that there's a lot of pressure. We know there's a lot of pressure. So we got to get the job. We got to move on to the next task. We got to look to the future. And what we're inviting is for you to like check in and be in the present, right? Check in with what's like what happened, right? What took place, and how you can feel supported in that too. But yeah, we know the stories, we've heard the stories, not all of them, but we've heard really some really impactful experiences that, yeah, that we need to make space for in our unlearning. So I wanted to, I know before we move on to main takeaways, I do want to say something. And what I want to say is, y'all, if you haven't subscribed to our channel just yet, make sure you click that button and subscribe, and make sure you click the notification so that you get notifications and alerts. You'll be the first to know when our next live episode comes live, comes to your computer. But yeah, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join our newsletter. It's a monthly newsletter, First Quarter Moon, where we drop some gems and wisdom and share a little bit about what's going on our end and our respective offerings. And if we are on Patreon now. So we're going to talk a little bit more about our Patreon, but you must, if you haven't, become a Patreon member, because we are building and growing a community of spiritualpreneurs, and you'll have to be there. And now we can go to main. Well, did you want to talk a little bit about? Let's go to main takeaways. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, let's do main takeaways, from today's episode. I think for me, as always, I appreciate, just the kind of commentary about the tokenization piece, like naming that was, I think, really powerful. Also talking about imposter syndrome, right? In this is really important as well. And also identity. So for me, like those are like my main takeaways about this particular topic. How all three of those things really tie into the grad school experience, but also how some of these things are still very much, coming up in places of reflection. Again, not only for myself, but um, I work with other social workers, other social work students, supervise folks, do consults and everything, and in order for me to be able to support around themes that might come up around maybe trauma that someone experienced during grad school, right? Like I need to have looked at that for myself and be able to name like, oh yeah, grad school was a traumatic experience. So, I think just taking the time out, even from like a leadership perspective, to really even think about that time for yourself, because I'm very sure that folks that you are, doing that type of work with, um, might appreciate just a check in about how was grad school for you.
I love that. I love that. I really want to just like emphasize the piece around making space for people to like really reflect and make space for their healing from their grad programs. Um, so many takeaways, but the one that I'm really like sitting with in my heart is around um, what I wish I knew around the stigma of spirituality and how, in a lot of ways, there wasn't room for that. And it feels important because I know that, and it's something Dr. Truesdale mentioned too, but like there is a lot more conversation now around spiritual practices and spiritual work as therapists, and people are really normalizing it. And I'm grateful for that. Like there is an awakening happening in a lot of ways, which is great. And I think it's really tied to like decolonizing, right? Like that there's a lot of space for decolonizing, like looking at like that decolonization is possible, right? In our daily lives and in our movement work. So that's staying with me. The piece around tokenization and imposter syndrome is hitting, it's really hitting. And I appreciate Dr. Truesdale and folks, who are in community with us, because you like having that language framed in that way is really supporting me right now. And I wonder if it's landing on you, friend, who's watching us now and watching the playback, whatever. But um, yeah, the piece around tokenization feels really important, and how it really gets in the way of learning. That's definitely a takeaway. Um, and yeah, imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon. Um, there's so much to say about imposter phenomenon. If y'all want to like learn more about that, be in conversation about that, I think that is the space that we're cultivating in our Patreon. But yeah, we need to have a conversation about imposter syndrome too. Totally. But yeah.
Okay. Let's see, the sun is doing something, here.
Yes.
So we are shifting just like the sun has, right? Um, and I, just want to highlight and say, not only to you, Biani, but again to folks listening here with us now and those that are, hearing us on the playback. Like, thank you so much for being with us today. We want to keep this conversation going. Please share your comments in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. And we're going to be back in 2 weeks, okay? For real. We're going to be back on April 24th at 6 p.m. Central to talk about another important topic on we got to do better. Reflections on unlearning practices from mental health programs, part one. We got some folks coming in that we are very excited to have around. And so, yeah, we want you to be there as well. So, unlearning must be a part of our work as spiritual practitioners and therapists. And it's our time for us to put aside the lessons from our programs that do not help and do not serve the communities we hold space for. In this episode, we're going to share the reflections and musings of our unlearning practices and experiences as spiritual social workers. So join us and some of our special guests for this important discussion.
I cannot wait. I'm so excited. Y'all better come through like in our next episode. And we're really featuring some dope spiritualpreneurs in the community. So y'all, thank you again for being in community with us and supporting a heart-centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, mental health, and everything in between. We'd love to stay connected and build the spiritualpreneur and healing community. So please, again, subscribe to our YouTube page, our Reclaiming Soul Work podcast. Once you subscribe, you can set a reminder for notifications every time we release an episode. You can also sign up at the landing page on our website to be notified of new episodes and future offerings. And please sign up for our free monthly newsletter, First Quarter Moon, where you'll get news, offerings, and updates from us. And we are on Patreon. Okay, we are on Patreon. We are building this intentional spiritualpreneur community. We're going to have amazing live Q&As, book chat discussions. It's going to be an amazing community just for spiritualpreneurs. And all we're missing is you. So check out our Patreon too. Okay. Y'all, we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.